What I always tell people is if you don't have a plan in place, you actually do. The state of Illinois has a plan for you. Oh, no. So there's a default plan, it's all by statute, and, the law allows you to deviate from that plan.
This is Dr. Craig Lemoine. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Land and Everything Else podcast. We have a really fun guest who I've connected with is Chicago, I think, as Chicago gets. So I'm very excited. So this is Tim Ritchey. He's a partner with Peck Ritchey and an attorney in Chicago, works in all sorts of areas, real estate being one of them. And we're going to talk today a little bit about, alive planning, right? And then oops after the fact conversations. Right. And I thought that would be really fun to add to the context. But Tim, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me here today.
Oh, yeah.
Very much appreciate the time to coming in here. Kind of my, life throughout education kind of brought me to law. And I think my background was actually at the University of Illinois. I was an undergrad in finance and accounting. So
nice.
I kind of went into the law thinking, I want to help people and help people in a financially positive way.
Oh, yeah.
So I think with estate planning, as well as, other areas that I do estate and trust litigation, kind of like where people don't plan,
right,
or where plans go south.
Yeah.
We try to add value. Our firm has been around for probably 30 years. I became a partner there probably about 10 years ago. And it's been a great journey, but I'm happy to be here and talk about these issues.
Well, thank you. And I think what's important to me is, as we look at the theme that's run through this journey of our podcast, it's the idea of that non-stock part of wealth, And when we look at Americans, an awful lot of American wealth is built through things like land or real estate or, a tangible collectible or, something that doesn't fall easily into this is a mutual fund with a beneficiary category, right?
Right.
So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about I kind of do this. We can do this in some of that had their act together and some of that didn't. But, when I come to you and I'm starting to build, I've got maybe some rentals, maybe I bought my first apartment building, and maybe someone said, hey, you got to get your act together.
Yeah.
What walk me through that? What's getting my act together look like, and share a little bit with me about planning while I'm still alive.
Sure. So what I always tell people is if you don't have a plan in place, you actually do. The state of Illinois has a plan for you.
Oh, no.
So there's a default plan, it's all by statute, and, the law allows you to deviate from that plan. There are, kind of courts set up to address, various things that may occur to you. Obviously, death is imminent for everybody. And then, one thing that people a lot of times don't call for but can come up, would be something that happens during life, a disability.
Sure.
Either, you get struck by a car, something that you don't typically plan for, or just the natural aging progression. So we like to address those kind of, in both contexts with somebody when they call. I mean, most of the time, people do call and they ask for a will. They call and they say, I want this document. And you kind of have to talk to them a little bit.
Sure.
You get some information about their background. I mean, you were specific, like I had this going on in, what I was getting into. I've got real estate. I've got, maybe a business, to your point.
But then I would think like a will is the least of their issues, right? Like at some point I start explaining what's going on.
Right. So, first you got to, get past the, and make them feel comfortable with you. You're not trying to upsell.
Right. No.
You're just trying to explain to them, well, the law, people say, I want a will, I want to avoid probate. That's kind of the context. And you say, well, actually a will gets probated. You don't avoid the court with doing a will. So you're not really doing what you're seeking to accomplish. So then you start saying words like trust. You want to try to talk to them about how you can pass property, without the courts being involved.
Sure.
And then, then I usually start talking to them about, powers of attorney or some kind of lifetime planning to kind of, discuss, maybe you don't want to plan just for death. I talk to people about, you never really know. You could walk outside my office today and get hit by a car and you could be in the hospital. Sure. I mean, there was obviously a very prominent case. I'm old enough to remember, and you are too, but like the Terry Schiavo case.
Yes,
where there was,
I do remember that. Yeah.
So when that was prevalent in the news, there was a lot of calls specifically about that.
Okay.
So people were very interested in it at that point in time.
And that's the power of attorney conversation? Is that what that leads into?
Right. Yeah. So So we do like to talk to people about, during life planning. And if you don't mind, I actually pulled some statistics.
Please do. I would love that. I think this enriches all of us. Thank you.
So before I came over today, I thought I would check because we do a lot of financial exploitation of the elderly. We do a lot of, I actually helped write the law and actually went down to Springfield to testify.
No way.
In 2014 about, civil penalties for financial exploitation of the elderly. And it's a topic that comes up a lot in my field, in states and trust. And it's very interesting because, the statistics are it's a growing, billion-dollar issue for for aging Americans. And I think when most people hear it, they think, that there is, well, you're talking about financial exploitation. You're probably talking about a caregiver, right? A caregiver taking care of dad or mom and taking advantage of them. But this is from the Illinois Department of Aging, Adult Protective Services, so that's APS statistics. And in 2013, they report that out of all abuser that were reported, the relation of a home worker was actually only 4.38%.
Okay.
So less than 5% of the cases, it's the person, like the caregiver.
Wow.
And statistically, over 71%, it's either the child, which is like 36%.
Wow.
Another relative, which is 35.65%, or a spouse, which is 11.92%.
So that's like almost 3/4 of
right.
of all the abuse cases are coming from someone in the family.
Right. So it kind of puts you in a different perspective.
It does.
And as far as the planning, knowing that, you're kind of looking at it from the context of, well, how can we put together a plan that allows you to get the person that you want to have nominated in there, but maybe put some additional protections in there so that,
I mean, that's a horrifying statistic, right? Like you kind of want it to be other. Right, of that list, but other was, I saw in your notes.
Right,
like
other was only 24%.
Other was 24, and then that makes family 71.
And most likely, it's it's kind of a crime of opportunity. There is some.
Is this like you steal grandma's checkbook? Is this like you drain an account? Like, is that the kind of stuff that falls under that?
It could be any one of things. So during life, somebody could be added to mom or dad or whoever's checkbook, and they're added on as a joint account. Under the law, we would say for convenience purposes only. So they're supposed to be cutting checks
on behalf of that.
And then they end up taking it for themselves. Because by law, if you add somebody onto the bank account, the presumption is you just gifted them that bank account.
Okay.
So adding them on is presumed to be that.
Got it.
But we've had cases where, people had farmland and, maybe dad became disabled and, son was, leasing it out or farming it and keeping the proceeds. And the bank account just doesn't grow what it used to do.
Sure.
And, certainly somebody should be paid for the work that they do, but also the owner of the property should get, the benefit. We've had those instances. Sometimes what arises is what we call undue influence. So you have, somebody who's a fiduciary, could be a caregiver, could be like a power of attorney for property, somebody who's handling or helping mom or dad handle their finances, and then they get a benefit. All of a sudden there's gifts going to them. Maybe there's cash withdrawals for them. It just kind of snowballs. So back to kind of the deviation. So you could do planning and you do powers of attorney. So the powers of attorney are meant to avoid court, right? So if you know who you want to have act for you, you can put a power of attorney in place and nominate somebody, and you could avoid a guardianship court.
Okay.
So guardianship courts are, typically where somebody becomes disabled, doctor says, you can't make decisions for yourself anymore. Has to be a medical doctor, though.
Okay. Yeah.
And, then you would have to really serve the person, bring them to court, have a judge adjudicate them. And it's a long process.
It sounds expensive. It could get hostile between siblings. I can see where that blows up pretty quick.
Right. So power of attorney is a very effective tool. We recommend it for almost all of our clients, but like the number one thing we say is make sure you trust that person.
Yeah.
And in most families, it's fine. But, obviously sometimes that doesn't always work out. Yeah.
Well, when you have the exploitation, I think that's, there's no going back from that. I would think that could be, as far as families and legacies go.
Right.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, and it could jeopardize, whatever funds were there. It could jeopardize even that individual's ability to get, future medical services. So Medicaid is, kind of that issue that arises sometimes where if the entirety of the estate is depleted, Medicaid has a 5-year look back period. And if they just look at the bank accounts, they just see, son getting maybe a bunch of checks, and it looks like maybe Medicaid fraud. They don't know. So it could rise issues, make issues there as well and complicate, medical in the future. So it has a lot of implication.
When you've got somebody coming in to your office, maybe even making the call, like I need a will, right? But they've got real estate they maybe bought over time. Maybe they've got some land they inherited. Maybe they've got a rental property. Maybe they've got something, kind of precious, or for that matter, even a basket of equities, right? Some non-qualified money. Where do you kind of start that process of, okay, we need to look at this holistically?
Right. Well, yeah, we usually start by trying to get the picture. Picture usually entails all their assets. You want to kind of get the family dynamic. Are they married or not? Because that does allow for some, tax planning as well as other things.
Yeah.
And you want to see where they want to leave the assets. It's not uncommon for people, especially with significant wealth, to include charities in their, and where they leave assets. But we want to get kind of a ballpark for what they have, whether or not we're going to be triggering any estate taxes. So that's kind of, a big issue.
Well, and you have different state and federal there too.
Right. So you have, over 4 million in Illinois, and federal right now is 13.61 per spouse.
So you could fall in one gap. I mean, you could fall in state without falling in federal.
Right.
But that's probably happens more than not when you're looking at the certain marketplace.
Yeah, you are. And there's planning to address, especially when you have, depending on their age, if this is going to be a growing pot, depending on what you want to preserve the assets. So with real estate, especially, a lot of times it's, very unique, and they want to keep an asset and pass it down to the next generation. So you're looking to see, what the plan is. A lot of times people have, maybe if they have multiple pieces of real estate, they incorporate that, and then you have a business,
Sure.
and you have tenants, and, there's, a legacy there you want to continue. And it raises just a plethora of issues about, where it's going to go after maybe the person who's running it goes. Is the spouse going to continue it? Is it going to pass down to the kids, or is this going to be managed outside?
Sure.
So you really got to explore all those various, options, and it doesn't always work out where a family member can proceed with it, and you're thinking about liquidating. So you try to get as much of that as possible, and you try to just plan around it.
Right.
And there's no answer I can give you that's this is what you do.
There's absolutely no. And I would think the more complicated it gets, the more that everyone's has their own value set, vision, goals, difficulties, right? Like,
right.
Can I manage this 4-unit complex? Yes. Is there property management? Maybe. Does my spouse want anything to do with it? I don't know, right? So immediately you start getting down this road of if-thens and, maps out.
Yeah, and the plan can change, right? So the
plan always changes.
Right.
Even wealth management plans are going to change, right?
Yeah, and you got to factor in, where people are in their life at that time. And, we do a lot of special needs planning. So there might be, an individual in the family that has, some kind of disability, somebody that needs a little extra help.
Mm-hmm.
You may have somebody who doesn't maybe qualify, for a legal definition of disability, but maybe is a little bit of a spendthrift, some issues there.
Sure.
Maybe a past bankruptcy, failed business, or
you could have an addiction problem too.
Addiction problems, sure. Maybe there's marriage issues. You got to think about the divorce. It's a common question that we get. What do we do about a spouse that may be on the rocks? Or so a lot of that comes into the discussion, and you try to obviously meet all those needs, and they're so varied.
So we've been talking a little bit about planning ahead of time, right? But I think when someone doesn't, right, life just keeps going. Time moves forward, right? There's not much we can do about that, right? So if when you get called after a death, is that a fun phone call? Like as far as does it go well, or is it always a little?
Well,
bit?
it usually goes one of a few different directions. Sometimes it's you did mom or dad's planning, so then that makes it a little easier.
Right? Can we get the documents or whatever?
Right. But a lot of times it's there's friction in the family. That could be, and it's pretty prevalent. Nowadays. I mean, there's a lot of different family structures that we encounter that probably 50 years ago were not as common.
And we had a very nuclear family. Well, we We have the legacy of that 50 years ago.
Right.
Right.
So there's usually a discussion about the estate planning documents first and foremost. And, sometimes those documents, everyone accepts them and sometimes they don't.
Oh.
So, you've probably heard the term maybe deathbed will, or, sometimes those are valid, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's, we were talking about undue influence earlier. Sometimes there's, somebody with a piece of paper, maybe a caregiver or something that's, hey, you should sign this. And the implication is if you don't, I'm not going to take care of you anymore. And then, the will might read or trust everything to that person. So,
wow.
So sometimes those are issues that are discussed on that first phone call, and you can kind of see where you're going.
Yeah.
At that point in time, another common message would be to us, I'm trying to get this information from my brother or sister, and they won't give me any information. They won't give me a copy of the will. They won't give me a copy of the trust. So
is that gatekeeping, or is that what's that founded?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, I think immediately after passing, because sometimes these calls are within a few days, So I think sometimes it's just there's not, an education there. I mean, wills are public record. By law, you're required to file them within 30 days. Otherwise, it's a misdemeanor. So the will should surface.
I didn't know
that. Yeah. It's not commonly prosecuted, but
wow.
At least I haven't even seen one done yet. But that's the encouragement to get it on file.
I would say that's some good encouragement.
Yeah.
So then, because it's public, I guess, sibling rivalry, or just not happy about the distribution, or I took care of mom, why are you getting half if I, did the work?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is, if it's all equal, you would expect it to be shared. So it kind of raises some red flags for the person who's calling. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes they just want to talk to an attorney first, or, get their ducks in a row. So it just depends. I try not to see any ill will. I say it's 30 days to file. So, this is week 2, let's give them some time. Well, and another thing is that you're supposed to file the original will. So if you can't find the original will post-death, the law presumes that it was revoked by the testator, the person who wrote it.
And that's why you can't find it. Right. So now you're going through the Illinois process.
Right. So then you might have to bring an action to admit a copy of a will, and there's a presumption you have to overcome in that circumstance. So so much can happen. You kind of just got to take a step back and say, there's no rush. This is, there's no reason to get this all done in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So, cooler heads should prevail.
When you find yourself in an actual courtroom or litigating, what's usually happened at that point to get there? I would imagine not much pre-planning, but what do I know?
That's a fair statement. Yeah, if you're in a courtroom, generally you're dealing with a situation where something went sideways. That could be that there was no will to begin with. That could be maybe they lost the will. Could be that just some asset just didn't happen to make it into the trust. So. I guess we talked before, will puts you in the probate. A trust, avoids probate. You have to fund that trust. That's a very important aspect. You got to retitle your assets, your real estate. You got to go to the recorder's office. You got to make sure you make that transfer occur and get it into the trust. Sometimes things happen that are unavoidable, and sometimes people ask me, why do I have to do a will and a trust? Well, trust obviously is for what you have time to plan to put in there. A lot of times a will is what we call pour of a will. It just says anything else that I have
goes into the blank family trust, right? Yeah, I've seen that.
And you could be, you could have a cause of action. I used it before. You could walk outside, get hit by a car. Well, you might have a lawsuit there. And that lawsuit, you obviously didn't have a chance to sign over to the trust. You know, so you might have to open up probate to do that. But yeah, usually there's something that brought you there that hopefully could have been avoided. Sometimes not, but generally, yes.
So when we talk a little bit about wealth management, financial planning, and we have a fair amount of awesome insurance agents and CFP professionals and RIAs listening to our podcast, a good market of them. That financial intermediary, we don't practice law. We aren't writing wills, but we can have conversations about values, goals, down the road, philanthropy, what someone wants to do. How can we help prep them to be more effective with you?
Yeah, I think it's, I do this in my practice too. I like to see and know what other fields can provide so you can flag those issues for the clients. So if you see something that's, in their portfolio that you see as an issue, like that they have a disabled child.
Okay.
That they're reaching a threshold of assets that it might trigger some tax issues.
Okay.
That they have a business, that they have land that, may not be easily disposed of. Maybe there is no plan with respect to it, or maybe there's a complicated plan. I think business interests generally require, some additional planning because is that business going to continue? And even if it's not going to continue, like when you're gone, does that next person, whoever that may be, who's in charge, going to have any idea where your assets are, what your status of things are, or who to talk to?
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's all part of a, kind of a comprehensive, is doing a job. Even like for me, I'm looking to see how I can help them by pointing them to the right people to help with them.
Yeah,
those
exactly.
Aspects. Yeah.
Because I think in the world of wealth management, financial planning, often we help somebody with, okay, well, you need to pick a beneficiary designation for this account, right? A pay on debt designation, or a beneficiary for an IRA or insurance. But then it almost always gets complicated, right? Because once it's like, oh, we should probably meet with an attorney and set up an irrevocable life insurance trust. Now, like the client has to be the one that takes the policy into the trust, right? So, I mean, it's still, I think there's still a real onus on the actual client. You can give someone the best of checklists, but like, there's things you got to do.
Well, and that's the biggest difference I've seen between, the kind of two areas, the various areas, but the two main ones is like when I get a call when somebody who's, passed away or something, everyone wants to act immediately because they see that there are steps that are absolutely needed to happen versus estate planning. It's, there's no real deadline until it's too late.
I mean, there's no deadline and then it's there.
Then it's there.
Like, you don't know what's coming a lot of the time.
Yeah. And that's the big problem. So there's a couple of triggering points that bring people in, usually having kids. That's usually the first time people come to us. When people are single or even just married, they don't seem to be quite there. They're usually younger, not thinking about it. But I had, and then if somebody gets a diagnosis, obviously that can bring them in too. But I actually had a client who was trying to leave her entire estate to her disabled brother in another state.
Okay.
And she was at the hospital. She was not going to leave that hospital.
Oh.
And she called and, we came out there with drafts, whatever, and she's making revisions and we came back. And at a certain point it was, you got to get this done. You got to make up your mind and let's get this done. You got
till about 1:00 today, just for safety's sake.
Right. Right. And so some people just don't want to finalize. They don't know if they've made the right decision.
So decision paralysis.
Right. Yeah.
That
sometimes,
happens.
The nudge I give is you have a plan in place, you have the default plan right now. Let's make it better. And then we could always make it perfect later.
I mean, I think that approach is fantastic, right? Thinking of intestate as the default plan. Right. And then you have a plan. It may not be what you want. Right. But
and not everyone needs, I know, for most of the time people that come to us are they have assets and looking to dispose of it. But sometimes we're just giving people advice, In Illinois, if you don't own real estate and you have under 100,000, you don't need to go to probate. You can do what's called a small estate affidavit. But anything, those thresholds are pretty low though.
Yeah,
100,000
that is low
in real estate. I mean, so that puts a lot of people into a category.
And then I guess just from the standpoint, let's say that you own land in Nebraska, you live in Illinois, right? Do I need to navigate that journey a little bit?
You do. I mean, the good thing is at least in the United States, they give full faith and credit to any documents that were executed validly in one state will transfer to another one. So there's that. That's a benefit. But certainly you're going to need to retitle assets if you own real estate in another state. You still need to make it comprehensive. And I mean, nowadays we have people that are international. They're handling estates. Assets in various locales. And sometimes it runs smoothly, and we've got one going on right now where they can't find the original will that was done here, and we're going to have to overcome a presumption. So
so it's going to add a layer.
Yeah.
So get your planning done, the more complicated it is, the more urgent, I would think, to some extent, to get it done.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last question for you is, all right, let's say I set everything up, right? And so me and Liz, 3 kids, where I'm at right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got a house. I got pretty boring investments with one exception. And we set it all up. Is there a general timeline where we need to revisit this from time to time? Because
it's a great question. We usually say, you should look at it like every 5 or 6 years, but certainly there's some triggering events. Taxes are usually a concern. We have a sunset provision on the current, federal estate tax. I think it's January 1st, 26.
You're starting to get some nervousness in the wealth management space. That's for sure.
Right.
Around that. Like we think it'll get, but what if it gets extended, but what if not? And we're getting a fair amount of
I've even heard some rumors they might
that.
drop it. So it's, it could
there's
be
some anxiety starting.
Yeah. So, if you hear any kind of tax changes, it's a good time. But too, I think you said young kids. I've got young kids too. One thing is, God forbid if there's, both you and a, significant other spouse are not around, you got to worry about that money flowing out, to minors. You don't want to put them into a minor guardianship.
No.
So, certainly there's a point in time where you are transitioning your estate plan from, minor kids, who's going to be the guardian, who's going to be looking after their money, to a situation where the kids are coming into, fiduciary positions. They're going to be the agents in the power of attorney. So usually that's a significant, change that happens. And then another big point where people usually come in, is towards the end of life. You've got, nursing home bills that most people cannot afford. It's like $10,000 a month. So there's sometimes
it's a lot of money.
Yeah. Sometimes there's Medicaid planning, that is entailed to try to avoid, the estate being eaten up by those costs. People are living longer, and that, means that people are spending more time in those facilities. So,
well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for your time, your guidance today, conversation. It was really great. And I think my takeaway here, to our audience is, as we are planning with, clients that may have alts, if you're listening and you're a landowner, so I know we have some of those too, like make sure we don't put this off, right? Because we want to plan while we're alive, right? We don't want to be stuck in a situation after where we go with the default plan. Right. Or the default plan in multiple states. Right. And I think I hope, fantastic, guys. I hope this nudges a fair amount of people towards getting their planning done.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me.
So thank you.
Yeah.